Hello and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be speaking about playing post-flop, and it's a very broad topic. I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. When you're playing poker, you get to the flop, you might be asking yourself, should I bet or should I check? How much should I bet? Should I call or should I raise? These are very typical questions to get into on any post-flop situation, and I just wanted to give a really simple way of thinking about this. This video might be a little bit simplistic, but I hope that people watching it can gain something. So I think it's really nice to think about your post-flop strategy as sort of a puzzle. You're trying to solve a puzzle, and you need to think about the parts of the puzzle. Like it's a jigsaw. Everything is its own jigsaw piece that is coming together in the puzzle. And I'm going to try and go into what I think these main jigsaw pieces are. The first most important thing to think about is the ranges, and that's your range and your opponent's range. So your range is determined by, first of all, your position. So if you open from early position or middle position or late position, this is going to massively change how your range is. You can't play early position the same way you play late position because you just have a lot more hands in late position. Your stack depth, so if you start the hand with 10 big blinds, shout out to the lizard. So if you start the hand with 10 big blinds, or if you start the hand with 100 big blinds, this is also going to change, maybe not as much as the position will, but this is also going to change the way that your range is constructed, and therefore the way that you should approach playing it on different flops and different situations. Next is the actions. So whether it's a single raise part or a free bet part, or you've called a raise, or if you are the raiser, or if it's a 4-bet part and how big you raised pre, all of these things are going to come into how ranges are constructed. The context, for example, if you're playing a cash game with no antes, or if you're playing a tournament with antes, that's going to change the way your range is constructed. Or if there is ICM, so if you're on the bubble of a tournament, if you're on the final table bubble, this is going to change the way your range is constructed. And for your opponents, obviously just their tendencies. We might have a really sophisticated way that we construct our range, but it doesn't mean our opponents do. Our opponent might just like playing 7-2 offsuit. Our opponent might like playing hands which aren't supposed to be in the ranges, and that's still a very important thing to bear in mind, because if we play against our own range, that's also going to be a disadvantage to us if our opponent's range is then different. And we need to get to grips with the fact that they don't play the same range that we do. I'm going to show you an example of two ranges, just a pretty common spot, which is if we're in a tournament, there's no ICM, so it's early in the tournament, we're 8-handed, we raise under the gun, and the button calls us 40 big blinds deep. So this is the way that these two ranges are supposed to look, and the red just means aggressive action. So for the range on the left, it's everything in red. For the range on the right, it's everything in green. And the red hands are the ones that would have been raised instead, so we can take them out. Two pretty quick things you can see from this. The player in under the guns position has aces, they have kings, they have ace-king suited. The player that called doesn't have aces or ace-king suited. They don't have kings very often, but they do have queen-8 suited sometimes, and they do have jack-8 suited, and they do have 9-7 suited, and they do have like 5-4 and 6-7 suited, and they have pocket twos more often. So it's not just that their range is slightly weaker, but it's kind of just different, and obviously that can change depending on the board. For example, if their 9-7 suited sees a board like ace-king 2, it's worthless. But if it flops a straight draw, if it flops a pair, obviously it becomes a completely different hand. The way that these ranges operate on different board textures is going to change the way we approach how to play those different board textures. So next I'm going to talk about flop texture, and there's kind of categories you can think of when you look at a flop. The first one is suitedness. So this is the board monotone? Is it 3 cards of the same suit? Is it two-tone, i.e. there's just one flush draw, or is it rainbow? There is 3 cards of different suits. How paired is the board? So is it unpaired, 3 different cards? Is it paired, there's a pair on the board, or is it trips, 3 of the same card? Pretty simple. How connected is the board? So if the board is connected, that means there's a straight possible. If the board is semi-connected, that means maybe there's only one straight possible, or there's straight draws possible, like a 10-9x board or a 8-7-4 board might be considered semi-connected, whereas connected would be like your jack 10-9, like loads of straights possible, loads of open-enders possible. And then disconnected, which is no one can even turn a straight. For example, most paired boards can be disconnected, like your ace-ace-2 type boards, or maybe a king 7-3, where there's only gut shots possible. That would be a disconnected board. And lastly, just how high the cards are on the board. So if it's a king high board, that's obviously a high board. If it's a 9 high board, if it's a 5 high board, and that's going to change how much things change moving forward. So a low board isn't going to stay low very often. A high board obviously can't become a higher board sometimes. If it's already an ace high board, there isn't any overcards, it's going to change the way the ranges operate. The other thing to think about is, do we have a nut advantage? So if we consider the two ranges I showed you before, if aces and kings and ace-king is more a part of our range, and the board has an ace or a king on it, or an ace and a king on it, that means we're going to have the nuts way more often, because we're going to have the sets and the top 2 pairs and the really strong hands. But just the same, if the board was 10-8-6 and we don't have 9-7 suited and our opponent does, or maybe if the big blind calls and our opponent might have 9-7 offsuit in their range and we don't have any 9-7s, then they're going to have the nut advantage in that case, and they're going to have the very best hands possible, and that might determine how we approach our strategy on the flop as well. There's also the equity advantage, so that's just comparing our entire range to the entirety of our opponent's range, and usually these work out pretty close together, but sometimes we might have 51% against their 49%, or we might have 60% against their 40%, but this is just an idea of saying who is slightly ahead overall, which is a nice way to think about it. And usually if you have an equity advantage, you'll be betting with more of your hands and just for a smaller size. There's also your equity realization, or your EV. For example, if you pull a raise with a hand like a pair of fours and the board comes 10-9-7 and your opponent has two overs like king queen, king jack, ace king, ace queen, these type of hands, well, your pair of fours is doing pretty well against those hands, but as soon as they bet, you're just going to fold, or at least you're probably going to fold. Which means you're not going to realize your equity. It doesn't matter that you were favorite because you're not going to get to the river and to showdown. So your equity realization with your hand is quite an important factor, meaning that the higher cards usually have better equity realization, or the suited cards and the cards that are close together, because they're going to have draws more often and they're going to get to continue more often. This is from Odin. This is an aggregate report of the situation we looked at before. This is an MTT, 40 big blinds deep. It's a single raise pot under the gun versus the button as the under the gun player. I just wanted to see what the most common checks were and what the most common bets were, just a small sample to show you how different flop textures can operate. And so these are the boards that we would check the most as the under the gun player in this situation, assuming the ranges are the GTO ranges, which of course isn't always true. And it just gives you a window into the fact that most of these are wheel boards, so like free cards, ace to five, they're monotone boards or they're flush draw boards, but they seem to be quite low. So you've got 6-6-4-5 that's connected low monotone. We've got 5-4-3, 4-3-2. So this already gives me a bit of a pattern that monotone boards we might want to check more often. Low connected boards we might want to check more often, which is a nice way to kind of build your strategy in these situations. These are the boards that we want to check the least. So it seems to be the trips boards, which are quite rare, so they're not as important to think about, but it's still nice to know. And also the paired boards with a 10 or a jack. They seem to be showing up quite a lot here, and also all of these boards are rainbow, so maybe we want to bet more often on the rainbow boards is an idea I'm starting to generate just from looking at this small sample of board textures. You'd have to explore it more to make some true inferences, but it's already nice to see that there's some small patterns here. Like, I want to bet more when there's two 10s because I seem to have more equity as the out of position player. Next is our opponent's tendencies. This is also a very important thing to think about because as we were talking about with the ranges, if your opponent is the type of player to never fold to bets even when they've got nothing, or always fold to bets when they've got bottom pair, this is a completely different approach we need to take against that player. This is quite a cool chart that I found, which is by Poker News. This is quite simplified, but everyone has a scale of tightness to looseness, and everyone has a scale of aggressiveness to passivity, and obviously against more passive players, we get to play more aggressively when we're bluffing. Against more aggressive players, we might want to induce bluffs more often and defend our range a bit more. And it is going to change the overall way, our overall strategy against those players a little bit. Also, their perception of us is very important because someone might be a very loose aggressive player who's going to play a very wide range of hands, but if they perceive us as a very tight player, they might suddenly not play the same way against us because they've still recognized that we are a very tight player and they're going to adapt. It's not as simple as this is the way someone always plays. It's how are they perceiving me? If someone doesn't perceive us as capable of bluffing, well, that's going to massively change the way they play when we make big bets on the river, or if we make big check raises, or if someone doesn't perceive that we're capable of trapping them. So if we play our range to ABC, if we don't check call sometimes with really strong hands, or if we don't defend our passive range too much, because we're not trapping enough, someone might try and exploit us for that reason. Or for example, if you see that someone misses value in one spot, you might start to get this idea that when they're betting the river, they're not betting with loads of these top pair hands, which that maybe you would bet yourself. So their value range starts a lot stronger, which might mean that when they're betting, they're either really strong or maybe they bluff too much because they're not value betting enough, depending on the player. How does my opponent perceive me? How do I perceive my opponent? How deeply are they thinking about the game? Maybe they're not thinking about my game at all. They're just playing their cards. Maybe they're thinking entirely about my game and their perception of me is solely how they're basing their strategy. And that can change how we want to respond. There's also just general tilt. So someone might be a tight aggressive player, but maybe they lose a series of big parts, a series of bad beats, and they might just get tilted. It happens to every player in some various ways. Some people it doesn't affect how they play. For some people it affects how they play a lot. Maybe they're going to start calling more hands. Maybe they're going to start just calling too many river bets. That's going to change for everyone as well. So it's very important to be aware of. Which is also why if you're not playing hands, you should always be watching how your opponents are playing, because every time a hand gets to showdown, or even the way people talk about the hands that are in action, gives so much away about what that person is like as a player. If you raise with King 6 suited in middle position, which might be a standard raise, and then when it gets to showdown, someone on the table makes a comment of like, wow, King 6 suited, like they're not raising with King 6 suited because they're surprised that you did it. So you can already get this idea of, oh, this person is never raising King 6 suited in the spot. They're probably a little bit more passive. It's just like a little clue into the image of this player. And obviously not, some people might be really clever and say things which mean the opposite, so you always have to kind of have your wits about you with it. But everything that people, it kind of sounds like the cheesy Negranu quote, everything you do at the table conveys information, but it is true. So watch out for when people get to showdown. Watch the hands they get to showdown with. Watch the comments they make about other people's hands as well, and just get an idea of this person. And you can decide how much that you've figured out about them and how much that should weigh into your decisions when it comes up. So just to surmise, the main factors in the puzzle, it's going to be our range, it's going to be our opponent's range, which includes their tendencies. It's going to be the flop texture. We talked about different flop textures. We talked about how our ranges are constructed, the important factors that change it. It's going to be our opponent's tendencies, which is what we just talked about, which is the player type, how they perceive us, whether they're on tilt. There's also the context, so there's a little bit more that I didn't talk about, like, are we on the bubble of a tournament? That's going to change things a lot. Is there any side games, like do you get free rake if you win with 5-6 suited? Do you win money off everyone if you win with 7-2? Or do you have any live reads? Is there something about their body language which gives you the impression that they are in the tighter or looser portion of their range? That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. I know it's a very simplified view, but these are the things that you should be thinking about when you're making that decision of what should I do with my range. You can either take the exploitable route, or you can take the unexploitable route. And if you're playing against a complete unknown opponent that you think is a good player, you should go as close to the unexploitable route. If you're playing against someone that you think you can predict in some way, you think that they might have certain tendencies to call too much or to fold too much, whatever it is, then you should navigate towards the exploitable side of playing. But all of these are the factors that you use. As poker players, we should be training our ability to figure this stuff out, because when you're playing in game, it is just figuring it out, and it's based on how much we've trained ourselves to think about these sort of concepts. Like if you see someone show up with a hand that's way out of the range, we need to know how to navigate against that, what it means, what we can do with our range, how we can best exploit the fact that we've figured this out about our opponents. It's one thing to know your opponent's loose, it's another thing to know exactly how to exploit an opponent who is loose in the way that they are loose. That's why this game is so beautiful as well, because there's always more things to think about. There's always new ways to look at the puzzle. When you're thinking about it in a live poker environment in real time, trying to figure this stuff out, I just think it's amazing. It's just a great experience. Like sometimes you're going to get it wrong, sometimes you're going to get it right, and all you can do is learn to get better at solving the puzzle. And if in doubt, just fold the river, because everyone's always got it. So that was pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share, all the good stuff, and I'll see you on the next video.
You need to understand that everything you do at the poker table conveys information.